leader on the Majority Report. On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Gerald Horne. He is the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston and author of, I believe, nearly 30 books. But the latest is The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th-century North America and Caribbean. Welcome to the program, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start here with the way that you start your book. And I should say that some of your books, your most recent ones, at least, are sort of working your way backwards through history. And this one starts at about 1600, obviously in the 17th century, and moves forward. And a big part of what takes place and where the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism in this century come from are a function of what happens to Great Britain during this time.
Well, you are correct, particularly concerning working my way back through history. Right now, I'm at work on a book on the 1500s, the 16th century. And as I dig deeper into the past, I come to realize that the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism are quite elusive. But in any case, with regard to the book at hand, I start the book by saying that in the early 1600s, England was a minor power on the fringes of Europe. By the end of the 1600s, England, soon to become Great Britain, was well on its way to becoming the planet's reigning superpower, and then passed on the baton, in a sense, to its spawn, now known as the United States of America, which has carried that hegemony into the 21st century, although, as you know, there is some question as to whether or not it will survive the 21st century. In any case, the answer that I put forward in terms of how this transformation took place in the 1600s can be reduced to one word, and that is slavery. That is to say that to telescope a complicated set of facts rather tightly, what happens in 1655 is that England seizes Jamaica from Spain. And this is, first of all, a knockout blow to Spain, which had a first mover's advantage, because recall that in 1492, Madrid had sponsored Christopher Columbus's trip to what we now call the Americas. And as a direct result, you have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people still speaking Spanish in the Americas to this very day. But what happens in 1655 with Spain ousted from Jamaica is that this blow is delivered to the pretensions of Spain, and at the same time it boosts England, because what happens is that England then moves rather aggressively to develop sugar plantations on the island of Jamaica. This leads to the so-called sugar boom, and sugar becomes wildly popular. It is not only used to sweeten tea and coffee, but it's seen by some as a miracle drug, seen by others as a marker of sophistication, and this sends currency and money flowing into the coffers of London, which then is used to build more ships, which are then used, for example, to oust the Dutch. Another rising power delivered a knockout blow by England. The Dutch are ousted from what is now New York City and what are now a number of the mid-Atlantic states of the United States in 1664, sending it tumbling down the ladder of leadership globally. And this leads to even more wealth pouring into the coffers of England. And some of this wealth is used to ensnare and enchain more Africans to grow more sugar. And by 1672, the Royal African Company is organized. And the Royal African Company is, of course, under the thumb of the monarch, and it's used to ensnare and enchain more Africans, developing more wealth for England. And then in 1683, you have another knockout blow delivered against a competitor and a challenger to England. I'm speaking of the fact that in 1683, the Ottoman Turks are stopped at the gates of Vienna, And I'm coming to discover, with regard to my project I'm working on now, that the Ottoman Turks are a major force from the, say, 1300s up until about 1683, but they go tumbling down the ladder of leadership globally, which gives a further boost to England. And then in 1688, the rising merchants in England then deliver a kind of knockout blow to the monarch. That is to say, they clip the wings of the monarch by dint of what we call the Glorious Revolution, which turns the monarch into what Queen Elizabeth is today in London, a kind of figurehead, and empowering the rising merchants, who then move to deregulate the African slave trade. That is to say, allowing more merchants to enter this noxious business. And they descend upon Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, delivering them not only to the Caribbean but the North American mainland. And thereby you see how England becomes a major power by the end of the 1600s.
So okay, so that's a lot of history very quickly. Let's go back a little bit and look at the way that this period, and I guess maybe the subsequent period of the founding of the United States, but also the period that leads up to it on some level. There are multiple perspectives of this, right? I mean, we can look at what we call now the United States of America as sort of a refuge for certain, so-called white people coming from Europe. We can see it as from the other perspective of Britain using these people to expand their power, and then, of course, from the perspective of the indigenous people, and those people ultimately came to be almost the fuel via their actual bodies of this expansion, and that is the part of the apocalypse. I mean, I feel like living in the United States, having grown up here, that I got a good sense of it as a good sense of the pioneer myth. Let's talk about how much we hear about the other part of that, the apocalypse part.
Well, the apocalypse, in many ways, is what happens to the indigenous population, who are not only liquidated and wiped out and ousted from their land, but many of them are then sold into slavery in the Caribbean, sold into the slave markets of the Ottoman Turks. In fact, you can probably find Native American DNA scattered throughout this small planet. And then there's the apocalypse that befalls Africa and the African populations, the millions who die on the so-called Middle Passage, that is to say, oftentimes tossed into the waters to be fed upon by sharks as the boats are crossing the Atlantic in a period stretching from about 1500 to the late 1880s, when Brazil abolishes slavery. And then, of course, there's the point that you also mentioned, which is a part of my book, which is the construction of whiteness. That is to say that England's population today is only about 65 million, and yet it was seeking to preside over this sprawling empire that came to include India, a contemporary population of 1.3 billion, not to mention North America, including what is now the United States and Canada, Caribbean islands. It came to include a good deal of Africa. And whiteness, as I tell the story, is a sort of constructive intervention. It's an intervention that is constructed, to deal with the fact that England, London, required a goodly number of soldiers and settlers that the England itself could not provide. Not only that, but the construction of whiteness also helped to resolve certain tensions in England. In my 1500s book, I'm dealing with all of this conflict between not only the English and the Irish, which continues to this very day, but the English and the Scots. I mean, the Scots, at least the leadership, so in some ways, they consider themselves closer to France. England England's long-time antagonists than they did to London. But by crossing the Atlantic, you saw a kind of reconciliation between and amongst these settlers of English and Irish and Scottish background under the new identity politics that we call whiteness, which was involved in subjugating and subduing a continent and generating tremendous wealth, as I said a few moments ago. And then ultimately, that platform and rubric of whiteness was extended, I would say, to the entire European continent. And in fact, not only the European continent from the Atlantic to the Urals, whereby those who have been warring on the shores of Europe, British versus German, German versus Russian, German versus Pole, Russian versus Pole, Serb versus Croat, Greek versus Macedonian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. Magically, when they cross the Atlantic, somehow they become, quote, white, unquote, and it also reconciles religious tensions and contradictions, too. In my 1500s book, I'm dealing quite a bit with the Protestant versus Catholic conflict, which I deal with also in the 1600s book. But there's a kind of reconciliation between and amongst not only Protestants and Catholics, but also between Christians and the Jewish population to a certain degree, too, because the Jewish population ultimately are incorporated into this broader category of whiteness as well. And in fact, if you look closely, you'll see that, as I say in a footnote, it's sort of a misnomer, which I confess, to equate whiteness with European, since you have folks who are defined as white in the United States, such as Ralph Nader, who are of Lebanese descent. And, of course, there are those, some sociologists have argued, that are of Iranian descent that are constructed as white in the United States. So this is a very flexible, elastic concept. It was quite essential to the construction of the United States of America, and it was quite essential to the rise of England in the 1600s.
So I have a couple of questions regarding that. One is, how elastic has that been through the history of the United States? Because I mean, what you're describing is this sort of imperial overreach by London. Therefore, we need more people like us in some ways to subjugate the people, the other. And, you know, we have some bonds that we can overcome, and we're just going to call them, you know, we have bonds that are distinct, at least in terms of our way of life, that we're just going to refer to as white. But it seems like, you know, then the later you get into American history, when indigenous people are not as much of an issue to the expansion of the American project, that some of that comes creeping back in, right? Like when Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants come to the States in maybe the late 1800s or the 1900s. Early 1900s, they're otherized maybe more than they would have 200 years earlier.
Oh, no, definitely. Absolutely. I mean, the construction of whiteness is a process. It can be seen more as a film loop than a photograph. It works itself out over decades, if not centuries. I mean, there were torchings of Catholic convents in the U.S. Northeast as late as the 1820s and the 1830s. We're all familiar with the sordid history of anti-Semitism in the United States, including, say, the lynching of Leo Frank, the Jewish businessman in Georgia in the World War I era, approximately a century ago. We're all familiar with the stories about Irish need not apply, for example, that often greeted some immigrants, and of course some of your listeners might have seen the movie Gangs of New York, the Martin Scorsese film, which deals with the difficult integration of Irish immigrants into the fabric of New York City in the antebellum era and in the U.S. Civil War era. But once again, this is a process. And today, as we all know, in the United States of America, in the U.S. ruling elite, you have represented various European ethnic groups whose ancestors once faced discrimination, including Jewish Americans in the U.S. Senate, U.S. corporate chiefs of Irish descent, U.S. corporate chiefs of Scottish descent, U.S. corporate chiefs of Italian descent. So once again, this is a process.
Does it flow? Can it go both ways? I mean, through time. I mean, I guess that's what I was asking. Is that was there a time when we're talking about in the 1600s where the need for more people like the British versus the indigenous populations or those people that they have basically kidnapped into slavery, did that sort of drop some of maybe the prejudice they had against Irishmen or Scottish, and those then got built up as they didn't need them in the same way they did earlier? Like, I get the idea that things evolve through time where people are more generally accepted, but can it also flow the other way depending on the need for those people?
Well, and that raises an intriguing question, a provocative question, which causes me to dust off put on my oracle cap and my cap as a seer, and to figure out, could it go backwards in the 21st century? That is to say, can the integration of all these different European ethnic groups into a larger fabric of whiteness, can that be reversed? And I would say yes. Now, I'm speculating, of course, but I would say yes, definitely, that if it can go forward, to me, it can go backwards. And I think it depends upon certain objective conditions. And to put my big toe in the water of the present, I would say that given the rise of right-wing populism in the North Atlantic community, not only in the United States, but now in Italy, with Brexit, and perhaps Quitily, that is to say Italy quitting the European Union next, there are some signs that I think people would be silly not to pay attention to that suggest that, yes, we can go back.